Mr. Saylor is the National Director of the Department to Monitor and Combat Islamophobia at the Council of American Islamic Relations. Mr. Saylor is an expert in legislative advocacy, media relations, and anti-Islam prejudice. His recent reports have concerned details of anti-Islam bias incidents from 2013 through 16, and those reports, other ones, have documented the funding and impact of Islamophobic groups in the United States. He's a regular voice in the United States and international news outlets, ranging from Fox News to CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, and Al Jazeera. In the last several years, Mr. Saylor has helped to spot and remove biased and inaccurate materials from law enforcement counterterrorism trainings. We'll now move to Mr. Corey Saylor, and he's going to talk about empowering the targets of bias crimes and incidents. Mr. Saylor?
So first of all, thank you all very much for being here today. I'm glad to be out of D.C., but we need to have an audience every time I come out of D.C., so I really appreciate you all making time out of your day to come and listen to us. And I always worry that those of us in the field that we work in, dealing with hate crimes, are some of the most depressing people in the room, and I hope we haven't depressed you too much so far. So before I go into my main remarks, I do want to remind you of something that I find very encouraging. The U.S. Constitution is an amazing document, but is flawed because it was written by human beings. And the Constitution, as written, counted African Americans as 3/5 of a human being, and did not give women the right to vote. We solved the problem of African Americans not being counted as human beings through blood during our Civil War. Or brought the problem to a newer level, shall we say. We mostly dealt with the problem of women not being able to vote in 1920, when women were given universal suffrage. So although things may seem difficult and things may seem flawed at times, I would argue to you that our nation tends to evolve toward the better. We have troubled moments without a doubt. We will talk about some of that trouble throughout the course of this conversation, but I am a longtime optimist that we tend to be able to overcome these difficult periods because I've seen it in our history. We always have struggles, but we've been able to overcome most of our major problems. And I would argue to you that the current tension that we are experiencing today is not the product of Donald Trump, as much as everybody wants to blame him solely for it. I would say we started seeing this stress right after the inauguration of Barack Obama. The people at the Southern Poverty Law Center who track white supremacist groups saw a rise in white supremacist organizing. We at CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, saw a rise in anti-Muslim organizing around about that time. So really it sort of has taken on a focus now, and I would say we are in the crisis, but it didn't just start yesterday. I think what's new about it, though, is that we have in the White House now someone who has specifically incited violence. So I'll point out just one example in February 2016 at a rally, and I want to thank Sue for dropping the F-bomb earlier, because that means the word I'm about to use isn't quite as bad in your eyes now. But at a Trump rally, he, speaking from the podium, Trump talking about people who might throw fruit at him while he was speaking, said, encourage the audience to knock the crap out of them. And if the audience members did that, he then said, I will pay your legal fees. So that is unique to me in this moment, that we have a president who is willing to go to that place on more than one occasion. There is also the uniqueness of the anti-Islam animus that has been expressed by this president. So be it him saying, I think Islam hates us, to his supporting the unconstitutional notion of Muslims carrying special IDs, to his Muslim ban, which is still being litigated at this point. And I say all of that because I lead into the hate crimes data, because I want you to see something that has happened since this administration has come in. But the main thing about the hate crimes data, yes, the tension started back in 2009, but what we saw is that the real sort of rise in violence, although it started around 2010 when it targets the Muslim community, What we saw in 2010 was people arguing against the construction or expansion of mosques. By 2014, what I saw, hate crimes were not in the top 5 types of incidents that we documented when Muslims were targeted. But 2015, hate crimes in the top 5. 2016, hate crimes in the top 5. Now in the first half of 2017, hate crimes are number 2 type of thing that we document, those targeting the Muslim community. The only thing it follows is harassment. And harassment we define as acts that are perfectly legal but are anti-Islam in nature. So if you go to a mosque and you say you all are terrorists, totally protected by the First Amendment, but that is harassing people based on their faith. This year, the first half of this year, we saw a 91% rise in the number of hate crimes that we documented. So when I say we documented, that means they were called into CAIR caseworkers and reviewed by our caseworkers. So a 91% increase over last year. Overall, anti-Muslim bias is up 24% so far in the first half of this year. But here's where I thought pointing out the notion of where our current president has gone is important in this moment. In the first quarter of 2017, 23% of the anti-Muslim cases that were called into us involved Customs and Border Protection, involved the government. So we stand in a moment where it is possible for someone who has clearly expressed anti-Islam bias to use the instruments of government to target the community. And we know they've tried through the Muslim ban. Those of you who didn't see Rudy Giuliani's interview, he was a Trump campaign advisor, and he said Trump came to him and asked him, how do I legally implement the Muslim ban? So there is an understanding that there are laws between them in the implementation of these things, but there is a desire on some people in this administration to implement these things. So if you weren't depressed before, I hope I've done my job correctly. So what are you going to do about it? I think that's what's really, really important to all of us in this room. And the first thing I want you to understand when you're dealing with hate, when you're dealing with bias, is there's something called confirmation bias. And that is that we all seek to have reinforced the things that we already believed. Very easy to understand. If you are a progressive and you watch Fox News, you're going to get mad really quickly because they're not confirming the things you think. If you're a conservative and you watch Fox News, you tend to agree with it. Watch MSNBC if you're a progressive, you'll find yourself nodding your head because they're saying things that you agree with. If you watch Fox News, you're going to have disagreements with it. And I say that because you want to make sure when you're dealing with somebody who's full of hate that you're not just simply saying things that you agree with but may not be in line with what they're thinking. And I find that all the time when I'm talking to people in hate groups. If I say to them, look, Islam is peace, I get cussed out every time because I'm not confirming what they've seen on TV. If I say to them, look, we're both patriots, I really love America. I love America so much that our fight and our organization's fight against ISIS, that group has added my boss to a short list of Western Muslim leaders they want to see assassinated. So I know I'm doing something right if people in Syria and Iraq are hating on me. So that idea tends to work better. If you're an individual who cares about what's going on right now and you talk at the dinner table with your family, please join the movement. Find a group that you agree with who's working on civil rights and join your voice with them. At the dinner table, you're important. If you're working with an organization, you magnify that. I also want, as I'm speaking to lawyers, we need your help. Every civil rights group I know is overwhelmed at this point in time. We need the expertise that's in this room to help us litigate a number of the things that we're dealing with. I also, to keep it really tight and short, want to point out a couple of last things. When you're in a situation dealing with hate or dealing with bias, no one in this room can describe to you the adrenaline rush you get when somebody who's full of hate starts screaming at you. None of us can talk about the adrenaline rush you will feel when you see somebody pulling a Muslim aside in the line and saying it's because of your headscarf. However, though you may feel that rush of adrenaline, you must remain calm. We want you to assert yourself. We want you to assert your rights in a calm fashion. We want you to unapologetically be yourself. If you wear a headscarf, don't take it off. Keep it on. If you have some other thing that expresses your identity, don't change yourself. But we want you to remain calm when you're engaging with people who are hating on you because of it. We want you to listen to what they're saying, find some commonality between the two of you, which can be really difficult. But like I said, I usually go with the look, I'm a patriot too, I really care. That somewhat lessens the cuss words that are being thrown at me. But by engaging them in that kind of a conversation, I have found that after a little bit, what happens is the deluge that's coming at me slows down, and we begin to be able to have an opportunity to have a real conversation. It is a very, very difficult thing to get to. The last thing that I want to point out, many of us have seen bias incidents happen in front of us. We have heard about what happened in Portland to the people who tried to intervene. That is a very rare thing. Normally, your intervention is the most important thing possible. But because everyone else in the room is watching this same thing, and they're waiting for someone to step up. And once you do, you will find support behind you. But in that intervention, what you usually want to do is not focus on the hater, but focus on the person who's the target of it. Boston just did a really good series of posters in which they told people, look, go to the person who's being hated on, engage them in a conversation on anything random, and just simply ignore the person who's yelling at them. And by doing that, you take the steam out of the person who's throwing the hate out. So I apologize for being super fast in what I said. That's normally a 3-hour conversation. I am here afterward. I have nowhere to go immediately, so if we can talk about it some more afterward. But I look forward to everybody's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Saylor. Let me just follow up. I know that you do work with law enforcement, and CAIR does. I wonder how the approaches you might take in a conversation with law enforcement might differ from some of the things that you said. You have particular, you're doing training for law enforcement. What do you train them about, and how do you deal with whatever might come up in those sessions?
One of the first and most important things that we have done is after 9/11, there was an industry that arose where people with really no expertise whatsoever were training law enforcement about Islam. So, for instance, we have right now one individual who goes around training law enforcement that mosques don't have First Amendment rights, that mosques are barracks, that the former director of the CIA was secretly a Muslim working on behalf of Muslims while he was in office. So, one of the first and most important things we do is try to up the standards of law enforcement training, make sure that we are actually getting experts. But when I talk to law enforcement, I come from a law enforcement family. I recognize that what these people do for a living is extraordinarily difficult. But it's also extraordinarily important in that moment not to target someone because you think they might be a terrorist, or because of their racial makeup they might be a criminal, or because of their racial makeup they might be here illegally. You have to target them based on some articulable reason. So when you're trying to, for instance, take down terrorist groups, you're wasting your time if you're just looking at ideology. You have to follow actual criminal leads that can lead to prosecutions. And by going down those paths, you're expending your time in a very useful fashion. So think about it. If you're trying to identify the ISIS person in the United States, just based on what they're saying, it is extremely difficult. It is a needle in a haystack. But if you see somebody selling weapons illegally to groups affiliated with ISIS, then you have an actual criminal investigation to follow. And wouldn't we rather spend our time taking guns away from ISIS than following people based on their ideology, which we may find reprehensible, but there's no way to prosecute under the First Amendment?